I just want to add a few things on top of your story. First of all, what does it mean to blaspheme? Now, I remember the first time I heard the words blasphemer, typically with some Hollywood movie where some very uptight, puritanical religious person called some rebel a blasphemer, and we, the viewers, were entirely sympathetic with the blasphemer because they were the rebel. They were the one who's fighting authority, the one who's trying to break down the strictures of uptight people. And the uptight person who screamed blasphemer was always a pretty unpleasant character. So I want us to understand this idea of blasphemy. The Hebrew word for blasphemy is lekalel, from the root kalal, which is probably connected to Hebrew root kal, which means to make light of. To make something kaved, kal. Kavod means honor, respect. Lekalel, therefore, would mean to dishonor, disrespect. Later on in the Parsha, where God gives the death sentence to take out the blasphemer, another word is used, the word nokev. Now, the word nokev means to pierce. So, to pierce the name of God is somewhat similar to the term lechalel, which is another word to desecrate. The Hebrew word lechalel is connected to the Hebrew word halal, which is something that is hollow. Chalul, hollowed out. So look at these words. To disrespect or make light of something that has kavod, honor and respect. The idea, linkov, to pierce something, therefore to empty it out of its meaning. Lechalel, to hollow out. Now, when these movies were made back in the 1930s and 40s, where there was always a person who yelled, blasphemer, and our sympathy went with the blasphemer, it never occurred to us, me, the viewer, that there were things that I held as sacred, even as a kid, that my family held as sacred. So, for example, I grew up in a home where civil rights were sacred. My parents were very strong Democrats, left-wing Democrats. They took the civil rights movement very seriously. And I think in my home, if someone had ever made fun of civil rights, it was said that civil rights are just empty, they mean nothing, I think there would have been anger. I don't know if the fight would have broken out, but it would have come close to it. So the more I thought about this idea, I asked myself, are there things that a person could say in my presence that would create in me real animosity, that it would hit my sancta? So I'll tell you one story which actually told me something about myself. I was a professor of Holocaust studies, as you know, for many years. And as a professor of Holocaust studies, in the end of the course, I had to deal with the theology. And there was a very disturbing theology that everything is from God, therefore the Holocaust was from God. And then the question, how could a just God allow this kind of evil to happen? It's the so-called, the question of theodicy, God's justice. And one reason I chose Kabbalah as my path, because I think it deals with theodicy in a deep, poetic, and disturbing way, and that is, God is not all-powerful. The brokenness of the divine tells us that God is not all-powerful, and therefore evil can occur despite God's will. I remember I was talking about this, that the Jews of Europe could not possibly have deserved the Holocaust, nor all the peoples that were massacred in the different Holocausts, in the Chinese, in Rwanda. And a person said to me, "Oh, Rabbi Finley's, those Jews in Europe weren't so pious." And I took a deep breath and I said, "You'll have to walk away from me. You'll have to walk away." Because I studied the Holocaust. I saw what had been done in pictures to Jews and others, to Russian prisoners of war. I saw the depravity. I read account after account. And for a person to say to me, "Oh, Rabbi Finley," implying, of course God meant it because those Jews of Europe weren't so pious. I remember I thought to myself, if this person says another word, I might lose it. I might lose it. I was so offended for the honor, for the sake of those who died in the Holocaust, and by extension, all those. And I reflect on that, I thought to myself, well, he hit my Kodesh Kodeshim. If he would have said, well, I don't believe in God, God's a myth, I could take that. But to say that the Jews of Europe deserved it, I had an eerie sense that something deeply sacred had been violated. And the person was a bit surprised. And to tell you the truth, I never spoke to him again. I never wanted to speak to this person again if he would have that kind of a thought in his head, that any group of people deserve that kind of depravity and evil in the manner that the Nazis did it, and the Soviets and the Japanese, that any person or group of people deserve it. But this is on the steps of a synagogue where I had been talking about theodicy. So whenever we look at blasphemy as something kind of not modern, not ridiculous, think of your inner sanctum. Think of your Kodesh Kodeshim, whatever it is, that if somebody made light of it, someone made fun of it, if someone didn't give it the respect that it deserved, whatever it is, I think for many of us, it has to do with things that are in history and in politics. There are certain things that a person could say that would wound you deeply. And that's why I wrote in my introduction to the Shabbat thought, by piercing God's name, it was a psychic injury to the people. So for example, if this person at some kind of Holocaust event stood up and said, well, those Jews in Europe deserved it, I think it would have pierced the room and created a horribly unpleasant feeling, and the person may have actually been banished from the room, justifiably. So the first thing I wanted to do tonight is dignify the idea of blasphemy. That is not just something that upright puritanical people throw at an anarchist, but rather somebody who pierces our inner sanctum and pierces the inner sanctum, let's say, of a group of people. Now, putting that entirely aside, I want to go back to our narrative, and Rabbi Manning's done a beautiful job of summarizing the different midrashic takes on the narrative. I gave a Devar Torah on the Torah portion in which Moses kills the taskmaster. I want to remind you just a little bit of that. And this is not only giving sympathy to the so-called blasphemer, who I think suffered a deep psychic injury, and his way to deal with the psychic injury was to attack the sancta, the sacredness of the community. Perhaps from his own perspective, it was justifiable. But when I look at the story of the taskmaster, remember where the midrashic narrative that Rabbi Manning so ably presented, and by the way, if you want to look this up, you can look up Leviticus Rabbah, Rabbah, chapter, I think, 34, paragraphs 3 and 4. Leviticus Rabbah 34, 3 and 4 gives you one of those sources. So I began to muse about Moses, that Moses saw, just the Bible here, none of the midrashic story that dignifies the life of the blasphemer. I'm putting that aside for a moment. I just want to look at the biblical story where all Moses did, he walked out and saw a taskmaster being an Israelite. So let's say the midrashic story is a theory that never happened for a moment. Moses didn't know why the taskmaster was beating the Israelite. I came up with the idea, maybe the taskmaster, maybe the Israelite picked the fight. Maybe the Israelite was impudent. Maybe there's a gang of Israelites walking around beating up on people, because in the next day when Moses goes out, there's an Israelite beating up another Israelite. So maybe the Egyptian was like a police officer who was beating up an Israelite gang member who beat up somebody else. We don't know what happened. Now remember, I had to forcibly take out the midrash that was discussed tonight and read the biblical text as it is and create my own midrash, which was Moses didn't give the taskmaster a moment to explain himself. He didn't say, hey, what happened there? He said, well, he was beating up another couple of people, and I caught him and he was resisting arrest, and I had to quiet him down and put him in handcuffs. Moses didn't ask. Moses looked at the taskmaster and beat him to death, buried the body, and the next day came out and found an Israelite beating another Israelite. Now, that gave me pause. Why would the Torah put after that story the story of another Israelite beating another Israelite? Is there a connection? So what I want to encourage you to do is, number one, study the Midrash. Now, it's very easy to find these sources. You can look at Rashi's interpretation of the Torah portion. He gives his sources. It's available on Chabad.org. Anywhere you go where you want to say Rashi on Leviticus chapter 24, pop right up. Rashi will give you the source of the Midrash that dignifies the blasphemer. That pops right up. It's profound. It's deep. It gives you access to the inner life of the blasphemer. But in my mind, it should encourage you to write your own Midrash. Use your own imagination to create your own alternate reality, because that's what the rabbis did. They weren't constrained by the biblical text. The biblical text was a launching pad for them to write the Midrash on the things that concerned them. That's the last thing I want to talk about tonight. So when I read the story in Exodus chapter 2 about Moses confronting the taskmaster and beat him to death, I thought of people who don't want to know the facts, don't care about what actually happened, think they know what happened, and then beat someone to death. And if not beat someone to death, protest and accuse people of things that are outlandish and not supported by the evidence, because their own assumptions create reality. So I want to look for a moment at Moses and say, maybe Moses was one of those guys. Maybe he saw this happening, didn't care to ask. He had his own narrative in his head, and that narrative propelled him toward violence against a person who, contrary to everything that we know about Egyptian taskmasters, by the way, I don't even think it says taskmaster. I think it says just an Egyptian man. Maybe everything we learned is false. We just have to read the text as it is and come up with an alternative Midrash, which for me felt like I'm not going to follow the party line. I love the Midrash on the blasphemer in Leviticus Rabbah, but I wanted to unlove it just enough to write my own Midrash. And that's what I want to encourage you to do. Now, the last thing I want to say is, why did the rabbis write the Midrash on the blasphemer in our Torah portion that he tried to get into the tribe of Dan, was rejected because his father was not from the tribe of Dan. His mother was, but his father wasn't. So the rabbis make up this elaborate story to create in us empathy for the blasphemer, quite effectively, by the way. And then someone brings up that even though the laws of mamzer, meaning a child born out of an illicit relationship, were not created yet, he was a kind of a mamzer. Well, what are those laws? They're very simple. Sex between a non-Jew and a Jewish woman does not produce a mamzer. Okay? It has to be a Jewish woman who's already married and has sex with a man not her husband. That produces a mamzer. So even the rabbis knew that even if the father of the blasphemer were this Egyptian man, and the Torah seems to say that, he's not a mamzer, which means he's not banished from the community. But who was banishing people from the community? Who were actively calling one person a mamzer, which means a person born of an adulterous relationship or an incestuous relationship? Who was doing that? The rabbis themselves. And when you read, I did my doctoral dissertation on Jewish status, including the status of the mamzer. So I read all the rabbinic sources I could on this status. And one thing I discovered was the rabbis weren't comfortable with this status because they knew that when they called someone a mamzer, it ruined them. And they knew that they were banished from the community and could never marry another Jew who wasn't a mamzer. And you might say to yourself, why would someone branded as a mamzer, a child of incest or adultery, want to even stay in the Jewish community to the point that they could only marry another mamzer? I remember thinking to myself, they're the most committed Jews imaginable. They said, okay, look, I'm tainted, but I want to be here. And I'll find someone who's tainted like me. And we're going to make a home, but you can't kick us out of here. So we're tainted people. So what? We can live with it. I mean, when I looked at the idea that a mamzer, a person produced from incest or adultery, can only marry another mamzer, my imagination went to work. Who are these people that love the community so much that they would say, though we're stigmatized, we want to be here and you can't push us out? That led to my own midrashim. But the core thing was, and this I believe, the rabbis were ashamed of themselves in the ways that they branded and excluded people. They thought the law required it of them, but they knew they were hurting people. So they both had to follow the law, but they also had human hearts. So what would cause the rabbis, who had to enforce these laws that created great human pain, why would they write a story about the pain of the mamzer? It was an act of self-critique. And that's the grand thing I want you to see here. As beautiful as the rabbinic story about the blasphemer, to make us feel empathy for the blasphemer, which it effectively does. Even grander than that is that it is a rabbinic admission of their own moral quandary, that to enforce the law hurts people, perhaps unnecessarily. And perhaps the rabbis in their darkest moments ask themselves, how could a just God create such a law that we have to enforce, that we feel is deeply unfair and hurts people unnecessarily? So I'm going to go even further. I think the rabbis wrote this story because the story was symbolic of their shame in hurting people, and also symbolic of their questioning whether all the laws of the Torah are just. So I've zoomed way out, but I want you to see how powerful the Midrash is. The Midrash gives us insight to the blasphemer, but also gives us insight to the authors of the story. Not only their care for the conflict between justice and empathy, but even though, in my mind, they're great theological quandaries. So what do we all learn from this? First of all, the Torah is yours. Just as it belonged to the rabbis, who when they read a little bit of the Torah, they said, we're going to make up a backstory. The backstories are great, but that's not the end of the matter. It's not the last word. You can actually create your own midrash, your backstory. And just as their backstories were created in such a way to deepen the characters of the story, so should yours. But just as their story was symbolic of their deepest questions of faith, so ought yours. So I want you to consider this evening, I'll talk much more about my topic tomorrow. I want you to see this evening as an invitation for you to read Torah deeply with the Midrash, but read Torah deeply with your Midrash and watch how the text comes alive. Now, my topic for tomorrow is really focusing on the blasphemer, taking the Midrash seriously, not my backstory about Moses, but the backstory provided by the Midrash, which is a man who grows up brokenhearted. So brokenhearted, so crushed, experiences such a deep psychic injury that his life culminates in a moment where in a way he does commit suicide by blasphemy, and maybe in a stoic way took it. He said, yeah, I did it, and I meant to do it, and you can kill me, but your laws are unjust, you people are unjust, you lack empathy, look what you've done to us. It's like, by the way, I've read suicide notes where people said exactly that to the survivors. Their suicide was a way to condemn the people who read the note. I've seen this with my very eyes. Now, whenever I officiated the funeral of a suicide, and there was left a suicide note, and the suicide was left with the family, and it was an attack on the family. I mean, it was a tough thing for me as a rabbi to help people metabolize. But I had to think of the depth of the psychic injury of a person who commits suicide to hurt the survivors. Try to imagine the depth of that psychic injury. and what it would take for a person to heal from such a psychic injury. And even if such healing is possible, there are some psychic injuries that we suffer that maybe we just existentially can't heal from. But in my work as a counselor and a clergyman, I've helped people with utterly devastated, broken hearts and psychic injuries. And I've asked them, if there's a way to get better, do you want to? Even the slimmest chance of getting better, do you want to? People often say, there is no way. I don't believe there is a way. This was so unjust. This was so unfair. It was so deeply injurious. I can't see a way forward. I said, well, do you trust me enough to try to guide you? And many people didn't move. Their grief was their life. But other people said, all right, I want to try to move from this utterly paralyzing psychic injury and take this tattered life of mine and try to sew something together. We will never heal from the scar and the hurt, but from the tatters we can sew a fabric. How do people do that? How do people sew together a fabric of life from the tatters of grief and wounds and psychic injury? I've seen remarkable things. I've seen astonishing things I want to share with you tomorrow. I'll consolidate a few stories to protect people's privacy, but there is a way to mend a broken heart. That's for tomorrow.